Hey everyone, and welcome back for part 2 of the barbecue cart. Today we're going to be focused on building the top for the cart. I'm starting with cutting the top down to 72 inches long by 32 inches wide. This will give me a 1-inch overhang on all sides of a cart, and this is so that I don't have to worry about the top and the cart not being perfectly flush with each other. If I ever cut it to the exact dimensions of the cart and it wasn't perfectly flush, you would see that little bit of overhang in certain areas. So to eliminate that, just making everything 1 inch bigger for the top. Next, I'm going to use my router with a 1/2 inch round over bit, and I'm going to round over all the sides of the board so that I don't have any sharp edges on the top side of the board. Now, if you're wondering what kind of plywood I'm using, I am using 3/4 inch maple plywood, and it is a little bit expensive, but I wanted to go with a hardwood to make sure that the top would be strong enough to support both of the grills once they are mounted in there, along with all the charcoal and everything else that's going to be put on it. If you haven't already done so, then click that subscribe button and the bell so you're notified when our new videos come out, and make sure to give us a thumbs up if you like this video. Now I'm ready to cut out the holes for the grills. First, I need to measure, mark, and drill the center point of both of the holes. Next, I need to attach the center pivot for the Milescraft Circle Guide Kit. With the pivot point attached, I simply set my guide onto the center pivot, then lock my router into place and set it to the diameter of the size circle I want to cut. This kit is really useful for cutting out perfect circles ranging from 1.5 inches up to 52 inches. So if you're interested in being able to do that, I highly recommend this. Just be aware that the kit does not work with every router. It works with a lot of them, but not all of them. So just make sure that if you have a router already that is compatible with this kit, or if you're picking up the kit and the router, double check to make sure that they are compatible with each other. My first cut with the router is basically just going to create a groove for the blade to follow. After that, I'm going to plunge the blade a little bit deeper each time, only going about 3/16 of an inch deeper on every cut. So it's going to take several full rotations around to cut all the way through to create this hole. Once you finally gotten to the point that your blade has plunged all the way through the material, you need to make sure that you support that center circle that your guide is attached to. As you complete the last rotation, within the last 3 inches or so, that board is going to start to collapse because it no longer has enough strength to be held up. At that point, your router can end up moving away from you, and you're either going to have tear out, where the board is going to take a big chunk of plywood from underneath with it, or your router can move to the side on you and end up cutting into the material that you don't want to be cutting a hole out of. Alright guys, at this point the barbecue top could be attached to the cart and the grills could be added. I've already checked, they do fit, but it remains unfinished and I want to do something a little bit different with this project. So I'm going to epoxy my barbecue top and I'm going to create a Carrara marble look with it for the final product. And of course it's fake marble, but I think it's going to look really cool when I'm done. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to paint the top and bottom of the top, and I'm going to paint it all white to start with, and that will be my first step for my epoxy prep. Now, the only time I've ever used epoxy in the past has been when I've epoxied the garage floor, and I didn't do that here, which was a mistake. I should have done that because ultimately my paint that I put on the floor ended up pulling up. So I'm going to try epoxy for the first time, and it may not work perfectly for this product, and I might find that in the long run the heat from the barbecue could end up damaging it, but I've never used epoxy for a countertop type purpose like this before, and I want to test it out because I am interested to see how it comes out, so that in the long run I might try epoxying my countertops inside the house. So I'm willing to do on this top because if it doesn't work out perfectly, then I could always just rebuild the top. But if I do it on a countertop inside the house and it doesn't work out, I end up losing out on a lot of money, because if it looks really bad, I got to replace the entire countertop, and that's a lot more expensive than just buying a new piece of plywood for the barbecue cart. Okay, now that my top is painted and sanded, at this point I'm ready to prep my garage space for the epoxy. Now, if you've never worked with epoxy before, it is a two-part system that once you add the two parts together, you have a very limited working time. So you really want to make sure that you go through and prep your entire area ahead of time and have all of your tools set aside, everything you need, and double and triple check that list to make sure everything's ready to go, because you do not want to have to step away from this at any point and go grab something that you left inside, or find out that you're actually missing something entirely and you would have to go to the store, because you do not have time for that. As part of my prep, I laid down plastic on the garage floor to protect it from epoxy sticking to it, and then I brought my tables over, and those are going to be my work surfaces to set my barbecue top onto, and I'm going to lay plastic and paper down on top of that as well to add 2 layers of protection. Now, typically epoxy can soak through paper, and I'm going to test it here with this construction paper. This is pretty thick, so hopefully if it does soak through, it's not going to be a huge deal because I got the plastic underneath. The epoxy I'm going to be using is from Stone Coat Countertops, and I bought their Carrara white marble kit, which came with everything needed to do this project. Now, their epoxy is highly rated and has one of the longest working times of any epoxy product on the market. You have 45 minutes for this particular one once you mix your part A and your part B. So that is quite a bit of time, but if you aren't good with working under pressure, then maybe this project isn't for you, because again, once you mix those two together, there's no turning back, and you gotta finish it basically within an hour, or you're going to have a problem. Your project is not going to be very good in the end. Okay, so all my prep work is now complete, so I'm ready to start mixing my epoxy. To start with, I want to have an all-purpose mixing container on hand, and I want to make sure it has a measurement on there for ounces, because that is what we're going to be using for the epoxy. So your epoxy comes as a part A and a part B, and you want to start with part B by pouring that one in first, and you're going to have equal measurements of both. So I'm going to start with 10 ounces of part B, and then I'm going to add 10 ounces of part A. Now I pour A second because it is actually thicker and heavier than part B is, so it's going to naturally want to displace it, so it's going to start kind of mixing itself in that process as I pour it in. Now with my 20 ounces of epoxy I've just poured, I'm going to mix in my white metallic powder, and I didn't do any measurement on this, but I do recommend that if you are going to be doing this, to bring a measuring spoon out so you can measure the precise amount of powder that you mix in. That way if you have to make more epoxy, you know exactly how much powder to add to it, so that you're not having a disproportionate amount and you have one that's darker or lighter than the other. And now I'm going to use my drill to help stir it up. Now you could use a paint stick for small amounts of epoxy, but for working with this large amount, you're definitely going to want to use a drill to help you stir, because it is very thick. In a separate container, I created 4 more ounces of epoxy, and I'm going to pour a little bit of my black metallic powder into that container. And since this is only a tiny amount of epoxy, I'm just going to stir this up with a paint stick. Now I should mention that for both of these, you want to stir them for about 2 minutes. Now, whatever the dominant color of the finish that you want your product to have, that is the color you want to pour onto your table first, and that is the one that you want to create the most epoxy for. So since I'm creating white Carrara marble, white is the primary dominant color of that piece of marble. Therefore, I'm going to pour my 20 ounces of white metallic powder mixed epoxy onto the surface of my barbecue top first. I'm then going to use a 1/8 inch notch trowel to spread the epoxy over the surface of my material. Now, if you're wondering why the whole material has been taped off, this is to keep the epoxy from running over the edges and me wasting most of my epoxy by it running off of the side. So tape off the material first, and of course I've made mine more difficult by having these holes in the center of it, but if I tape it off, I keep all the epoxy trapped onto the surface so I can spread it around without throwing half of it off of the sides. So as I started to spread the epoxy around, I realized I didn't have enough of it, so I quickly stopped and created 16 more ounces of white metallic epoxy, mixed that up, and then added it to the surface. So after you finish spreading the epoxy around all over the surface and you feel you've hit all the areas, you want to come back with a small paintbrush and you're going to chop the surface of the epoxy. Now you're essentially accomplishing two things here by chopping the surface. One, you're eliminating the trowel lines that were left in the epoxy when you were spreading it around. And two, you're also helping to make sure that every square inch was covered by epoxy, because as I constantly chop the surface, I'm removing epoxy, then applying it back to the tabletop surface, and therefore ensuring that every little bit is covered with epoxy in the process. And I want to do this in a kind of like random organic manner. I don't want it to be all machine-like by going straight across the surface in straight lines. I just want to randomly do this, but I also want to cover every square inch while doing it. Now that I finished chopping the surface, I'm going to remove the tape from the outer edges and from the holes in the center. And since I need to make sure that I have epoxy on those outer edges and in the center for the holes, I'm going to take my paintbrush and I'm just going to do a long continuous stroke across there. I have epoxy on the brush and I've got epoxy starting to run over those edges, so there's going to be more than enough epoxy to cover those surfaces. As I finish up applying epoxy to the edges, my next step here is going to be applying a heat source to the epoxy with either a torch or a heat gun. Now I recommend using a torch for this process, and what I'm looking to do here is by applying heat to the surface, it's going to pop air bubbles that are stuck in the epoxy. Now something I learned after the fact was that not all torches are made the same. Although the tanks are basically all interchangeable, the heads are different, and in my case, the head I bought was not the one that I need for this job, because it couldn't go past 60 degrees. Now you can see here that most of the time I have it rotate at 90 degrees, and that is a problem because you will briefly see some flare-ups where the flame will become about twice the size and then it will quickly extinguish itself, and that is the issue that I had. It was very difficult to torch the entire surface because of the fact I couldn't rotate it past 60 degrees, and anytime I did, the flare-up would happen. After torching the surface as best I could, I was ready to add my black epoxy to be able to create that Carrara marble look. So by adding your color, what you want to do is to chop it in. So what I do is I add some black epoxy to the brush, and then I simply dab it into one location and then spread it out from there. Now I don't want to overdo it with the black, so if you have too much on there, then just keep spreading it around until you get the look that you desire. And if you want it darker, then of course just add more. And if you want it lighter, then just put less on there. At this point in the process, there's nothing scientific to this. This is really more like arts and crafts class. So it's really about how much color you want to add, what design you want it to look like, and just what the finished product you have in mind is. So you can just add streaks. You could just put lines into it and have like veins in the marble if you wanted to, or you can just spread it around the way I'm doing and just make it a very cloudy, very subdued look. When I was fully finished at the end of applying all the epoxy, I ended up having more black epoxy made than I needed to. So I made 4 ounces originally, if you remember, and I only ended up using 2 ounces of it. So essentially I kind of wasted 2 ounces of epoxy. So if you're doing a similar size surface like I'm doing and you're adding your color, just keep in mind I would only create about 2 ounces at a time and just make more as you need it, rather than making too much at one time and you can't take that back and you end up just wasting that epoxy. Now after you finish adding your final color to the table, you may choose to spread it around and help soften those edges a bit, and you really want to use a heat gun for this. So you can see I'm using my wife's old hair dryer for this, and while it did move the product and help kind of to mix it up a bit more with the white epoxy so that my black lines weren't quite as harsh, the problem here was that because it's not really applying any serious heat to the surface, it was really just more likely adding air into the surface, which meant I had to spend longer torching that air back out. So my recommendation here is if you do not have a heat gun, then just skip this step entirely. Don't bother using a hair dryer. Just skip it and move on to applying the torch again to the surface. So once you're happy with how your surface of your epoxy looks, having added your color, your final step is to torch it out one more time. And this is where I recommend that the torch is more important than the heat gun, because that torch is just giving you much better control and a heat source than the heat gun does. And the heat gun, of course, adds a bit more air movement to the surface, which means you are swirling it around. So if you wanted to have very distinct veins on the surface of your top, your heat gun is going to start to mix those up and spread them out, whereas the torch torch is not going to do that. So if you have to choose between two of the products, I would take the torch every time and get the heat gun later on if you want it. Alright guys, it's been 4 days since I applied the epoxy and the finish looks really good in my opinion. Within the first 24 hours or so, it was kind of sticky to the touch. You know, it was still curing, but now it is fully hardened and it feels great, really smooth to the touch. Now there are a few areas where there are some air bubbles trapped in there, and that is definitely my fault. That is not a fault on the product. Most likely what happened is, again, since I had that issue with the torch where I couldn't turn it upside down without it flaring up on me, I just had some surface areas, especially towards here in the middle and then just around the circles here where the flame wasn't able to reach, where I just have some of those air bubbles trapped in, and you can see them under correct lighting, or if you kind of like bend down and get the correct angle, you can see them. And there's one area where you can actually feel it. It's right over here. You may not be able to see it in the camera. But overall, for a first attempt, I'm really happy with the way this turned out. So again, if it doesn't hold up in the long run to being outside and to the barbecue heat, I'm okay with that, because this was primarily used as an attempt where it's kind of sacrificial in my opinion. If it doesn't hold up, that's fine, but I got to experience and work with the product for the first time, learn a whole bunch about it, and now I'm more comfortable with possibly applying it to my countertops inside now that I've learned what I could on this top out here, where if it doesn't turn out great, that's okay. It's gonna be exposed to the elements anyway. Okay, at this point I am gonna wrap up this video, and unfortunately, I know I originally said in the first part that this was gonna be a two-part video and you would see that the final product in the second video. That's not gonna happen. I am gonna extend this to a part 3 where you will see me finally attach the top to the barbecue cart, do some finishing touches to the top itself and the cart, and then install the grills and everything. So I hope you'll stick around and join me for that next video. And like I said earlier, if you haven't subscribed, then please do so now and give me a thumbs up if you liked the video.